When looking at the history of visual novels, there are many key points that can be examined to learn how they grew into their current state. You could explore the origins of adventure games in Japan, study how visual novels evolved within the PC market, or even investigate how American publishers helped inform our understanding of the genre. But no matter where you start, or which company you spotlight, at some point down the rabbit hole, you will need to talk about Chunsoft and their foundational sound novel franchise. When examined on paper, sound novels don't seem that impressive. They're basically just digital choose-your-own-adventure books, with sometimes nothing more than simple images and atmospheric soundscapes to accompany them. Yet this straightforward experience had a certain je ne sais quoi that captured audiences' imaginations in 90s Japan. While the franchise is barely present in the modern game industry, Chunsoft's sound novels established a formula that would be copied, iterated on, and merged with other types of gameplay, basically serving as the progenitor to the novel-style adventure genre in all its forms, and even a source of inspiration for creators in other genres. But despite its historical importance, Chunsoft's sound novels are almost completely unknown in the English community, due to many of their titles being trapped behind a language barrier until relatively recently. So today, we are going to do a deep dive into their history and explore the context in which these games were developed, because in many ways, the history of Chunsoft's sound novels are a story about context. A story about how a perfect storm of events led to their creation, and how it struggled to find a new context where it could remain relevant in the ever-changing landscape of video games. So let's turn to the first page in this retrospective and learn the who, what, where, and how of sound novel. During the dawn of Japan's personal computer market in the early 1980s, a young hobbyist programmer named Koichi Nakamura would establish one of the most important developers in the history of Japanese video games. Growing up, Nakamura was obsessed with arcade games, and this obsession led to him creating his own clones of his favorite titles in high school, using a computer he borrowed from a senior in his math club. Nakamura then later began submitting these clones as type-in programs to popular PC magazines like I.O., where he quickly became well known to readers for his well-constructed programs. All this eventually led to Nakamura getting his first fully original game published by Enix in 1983, after it won an award in the company's first programming contest. The game, titled Door Door, was an eloquently designed arcade-like experience that became such a big hit that it helped in many ways to increase the popularity of PC video games across Japan during the early days of the market. All this success gave Nakamura the confidence and finances he needed to turn his hobby into a profession, and he wasted no time doing so. During his first year of university, when he was only 19, he gathered a group of 4 like-minded friends and founded a small development studio in April 1984 called Chunsoft. The studio was named after the cute blob-like protagonist from Door Door, which in turn had previously been a nickname for Nakamura due to his love of mahjong. During its early years, Chunsoft felt more like a club that met after school, rather than a real-deal suit-and-tie company, as all the employees were still college students that worked on games in between classes, and their original office space was just Nakamura's apartment. The company's first game was for the PC, but the studio really came into its own once they shifted their focus to Nintendo's then up-and-coming Famicom home console. Impressed with the system's arcade-like graphics, Nakamura enthusiastically jumped into the Famicom market with a port of Door Door in 1985, which was a big hit for its time. But for their second console game, an exec at Enix suggested they develop a more adult-oriented title, specifically a port of a crime-solving adventure game called the Portopia Serial Murder Case. Portopia was originally a PC game developed by a freelance writer named Yuji Horii, a man Nakamura had actually met a few years prior during the award ceremony for Enix's programming contest. Horii was there covering the event for Shonen Jump magazine, but was also one of the contest's winners, receiving a prize for his sports title, Love Match Tennis. After that, Horii continued working with Enix, much like Nakamura, and developed Portopia in June 1983, which became a pretty big success for its time, selling a whopping 17,000 copies in its first year. So, Nakamura worked with Horii to bring his PC hit to consoles, completely reworking Portopia for the Famicom's hardware. While adventure games had been popular in the Japanese personal computer market for several years at this point, Portopia was the very first example of its genre on the Famicom, and it blew away its PC sales numbers, eventually selling a staggering 700,000 copies. This release ignited an adventure game boom on the Famicom, and established Nakamura's working relationship with Yuji Horii, with Portopia's success directly leading to the duo's next collaboration, 1986's Dragon Quest. A game that needs no introduction, Dragon Quest is a monumentally important title in the history of video games that helped popularize RPGs in Japan. While Yuji Horii is credited as the father of the franchise, the first 5 Dragon Quest titles were developed by Chunsoft, with Nakamura himself serving as the director for every 8-bit installment. With all these hits on the Famicom, Nakamura's company grew from a scrappy startup to the co-creators of some of the most popular video games in the entire country. However, when Chunsoft had to increase the size of their production to create a sequel to Dragon Quest, it caused quite a lot of turmoil. The small studio of college students was not prepared to handle the huge workload of making Dragon Quest II, and by the end of the sequel's development, all the founding members besides Nakamura had quit, and Chunsoft was basically in danger of closing. Things remained unstable at the studio for some time, as talent came and went with each new Dragon Quest title. By 1990, 6 years into its life, Chunsoft had finally begun to settle. But after grinding away on Dragon Quest after Dragon Quest, Nakamura believed he had achieved all that he wanted to do with the franchise, and was now looking ahead to the future. A future where Chunsoft could publish its own games independently, outside the ownership of a third party like Enix. And so, with the Famicom's successor on the horizon, Nakamura saw an opportunity to start fresh on a new platform, and began moving away from Dragon Quest. But what would the now legendary co-creators of Japan's favorite RPG series develop as their first self-published title? In a shocking twist, they would make something much smaller in scale, something that was barely even considered a video game by some. When Chunsoft first sat down to make plans for their first fully original title, they had grand ambitions to create a game that would surpass Dragon Quest. Several ideas were thrown around during their initial meetings, including an RPG that contained simulation elements, similar to titles like Populous and SimCity. However, the early 90s was an incredibly busy period for Chunsoft. Not only were they in the middle of creating Dragon Quest V by this point, but they were also working on Famicom Jump 2 and Tetris 2 plus Bomb Bliss, all while they were also helping to localize the Dragon Quest titles for North America. Available programmers were few and far between, and graphic artists were in very short supply. Therefore, instead of creating a massive RPG, Nakamura began brainstorming different genres that could be realized by a fairly small dev team. At the same time, despite how popular Dragon Quest was, Nakamura often met friends and family that found the RPGs too complicated to get into. Video games were becoming more and more designed towards hardcore fans, which motivated Nakamura to create a title that could ease first-time users into playing games. That's when the idea of making a text adventure popped into his head. The text adventure genre was a popular form of interactive fiction in the early days of personal computers, and Nakamura himself had been a fan of American titles like Zork and the domestically produced Omotesando Adventure. The genre was simple in presentation, usually just made up of text on a blank screen, and it didn't demand complicated inputs, with the player only required to type in simple commands to progress a narrative. It seemed like the perfect candidate for Chunsoft's first self-published title, as it wouldn't require a lot of resources to make, and few things were more accessible to a general audience than curling up to read a good story. However, the text adventure had never really taken off in the Japanese market, due to the simple fact that it wasn't easy for early PCs to display kanji characters. For those unaware, the Japanese written language is made up of 3 alphabets: hiragana, katakana, and kanji. While the first 2 are fairly simple in appearance and only contain a handful of characters, kanji is far more complex, and there are literally thousands of them. Therefore, many early Japanese adventure games opted to instead write their games entirely in one of the other alphabets, or sometimes even in English. Text-heavy games on the Famicom, like Dragon Quest, were also usually written entirely in hiragana and katakana, but the lack of kanji sometimes made sentences difficult to parse out for some players. But this would no longer be an issue on Nintendo's new system, the Super Famicom. While many lauded the console for its Mode 7 effects, Nakamura realized that the newfound power of this hardware would allow developers to easily render kanji characters, and therefore make a genre like the text adventure accessible to a Japanese audience for the first time on consoles. But even so, by the 1990s, the text adventure was seen as old-fashioned, with graphic adventures overtaking the genre in popularity. However, Nakamura saw untapped potential in the text adventure, due to its ability to create a world inside the player's imagination without the need for visuals. So, he looked to take advantage of another new feature of the Super Famicom to modernize the genre's presentation for the current era: sound. The Super Famicom was equipped with a sound chip that was quite advanced for its time, capable of producing far more realistic audio compared to the bleeps and bloops of the original Famicom. The chip could play back samples of real-world sounds, and had the ability to output in stereo, which allowed developers to create more three-dimensional soundscapes. Nakamura's thought was that these new audio capabilities could add a new layer of immersion and excitement to the text adventure, while still retaining the genre's focus on words. Confident in his idea, Nakamura pitched his concept to one of Chunsoft's key employees over drinks. That person was Kazuya Asano. Back in the mid-80s, Asano was a computer programmer that was desperately looking for a way to enter the video game industry due to his love of Dragon Quest II. But despite his love, Asano had somehow never heard of Chunsoft until a friend of his showed him a help wanted ad for the company, which listed Dragon Quest as one of their past works. After seeing that, he immediately got a job at the company and was soon knee-deep working as an assistant on Dragon Quest III. Asano had hit it off with Nakamura during his job interview, and would go on to work alongside him as a programmer on Dragon Quest IV through V. He quickly became an invaluable employee at the company, and was now helping to come up with Chunsoft's first original title. When Nakamura told Asano about his idea for a new type of text adventure, he was greatly intrigued. The concept reminded him of a novel he had read in high school, where the author included suggestions for music the reader should listen to while experiencing certain parts of the book. The idea of replicating that experience in the form of a game sold Asano on the idea, and with no other realistic projects to compete with it, the studio went ahead with Nakamura's suggestion. Thus, a very small team within Chunsoft began hashing out the details of how to make a text adventure on the Super Famicom. Development on the text adventure began sometime in the early 90s, with Koichi Nakamura and Kazuya Asano leading the project. Nakamura was a programmer at heart, but he forgoed his usual technical role to focus purely on being this new game's director and producer. Similarly, Asano had exclusively worked as a programmer up to this point, but he actually had a background in liberal arts and enjoyed writing stories in his free time, so he was put in charge of creating the text adventures scenario. With this setup, everything about the game's premise evolved out of the idea that the team was making a game with a focus on audio. Horror was selected as the story genre, since it lent itself well to atmospheric soundscapes, and with that in mind, a classical spooky mansion was selected as the setting. In the final game, the story stars a young man who can be named by the player, and his girlfriend, Nami, who are stuck in the countryside during a rainstorm after their car breaks down. With no other choice for shelter, the two dry themselves off in a seemingly abandoned Western-style mansion, ominously surrounded by Otogirisou flowers. As the couple explores the building, they run into all sorts of unnerving occurrences as they piece together clues surrounding the mansion's mysterious past. Because of the setting, the text adventure was tentatively called Mansion early in development, but eventually the team settled on the name Otogirisou due to the flower's prominence in the story. The premise and title were in place, but how exactly would Otogirisou play? Adventure games, both text and graphical alike, could often be fairly obtuse in the 80s and early 90s. Normally, the player would have to use a text prompt or verb window to input different commands in order to solve puzzles. But if someone wasn't able to figure out the exact solution the developer intended, the player would be stuck and could never see the conclusion to the story. As stated earlier, Nakamura wanted Chunsoft's first self-published title to be accessible to people that were unfamiliar with games, so the team did their best to obfuscate these frustrating elements the adventure genre was known for. With this goal in mind, the gameplay was streamlined to the point that all verb commands were removed, and the only interaction required of the player was selecting one of several choices that would change the events of the story. Even if a player didn't know how to use a controller, and they just selected a single button for the entire game, they would still eventually reach some kind of conclusion. There were basically no game overs or dead ends. Instead of solving puzzles like in most adventure games, the gameplay was now focused on exploring the different paths in the branching narrative. As Otogirisou began to take shape, the team realized that they were creating something very different from a typical text adventure. In fact, you could say they were creating a totally new type of game, something that was more akin to a digital book. And every genre needs a title, so after some brainstorming, the staff at Chunsoft eventually came up with a term for their new type of audio-enhanced, novel-like adventure game, the sound novel, a term that would be heavily used in marketing Otogirisou as a landmark title in a groundbreaking new genre. Things were starting to come together for Chunsoft's first self-published game, but there were also a lot of challenges along the way. No one had made a title quite like Otogirisou before, so the team struggled a lot on the basics of how it should be constructed. Should the game be written more like a screenplay and exclude descriptive details? Should the text draw on screen in time with the story, like a karaoke video? All of these questions had to be answered throughout development, but the biggest hurdle for the team was the scenario itself. Asano enjoyed writing as a hobby, but he had never done it professionally before this project, and Otogirisou's branching structure meant that a very large volume of text needed to be written. After penning the main path in the story, Asano realized that writing all the other branches would be too much for him to handle on his own. So Koichi Nakamura began looking for some outside help, and was eventually introduced to a craftsman of the written word named Shukei Nagasaka. Nagasaka was a fairly well-known screenplay writer that had experience in a variety of fields, working on everything from film, animation, tokusatsu, and TV dramas. He was even an accomplished novelist, just recently winning the Edogawa Rampo Prize in 1989. At some point, Nagasaka was also in talks to add video games to his long resume, when an unnamed company was looking to hire him to work on an upcoming title. However, that project ended up going nowhere, but it led to the company later introducing Nagasaka to Koichi Nakamura, who was looking for help creating what was essentially a digital version of a game book, basically a choose-your-own-adventure novel. Nagasaka thought that the concept behind these gamified novels had a lot of storytelling potential, and had hoped to publish his own game book during the mid-1980s, when there was a game book craze going on in Japan. However, his idea was never realized, but now Chunsoft was offering a job where he could return to this concept in the form of a video game. So, after resolving some scheduling conflicts, Nagasaka began working on Otogirisou, where he helped flesh out the title's narrative, while Asano implemented the text into the game itself, creating the timing of the sound effects and other elements. But Nagasaka wouldn't just write additional story elements, he would also contribute to the actual gameplay as well. The team at Chunsoft originally wanted to structure Otogirisou like a tree, where the player would start at one point and then various branches would lead to different endings. But Nagasaka disagreed with this approach, and convinced Asano and Nakamura to try something a bit different. Rather than a tree, Nagasaka's idea was to structure the game more like an amidakuji, also known as a ghost leg lottery. Basically, there would be multiple storylines progressing in tandem with each other, and the player's choices would cause them to move in and out of these different tracks, eventually leading to one of several endings. Each playthrough of the game was relatively short, but the number of combinations through this ladder was so large that it gave the illusion that the game was a never-ending loop, where the player could experience a slightly different horror story each playthrough. To add to this illusion, Otogirisou even keeps track of how many loops the player has made through the game, and makes slight alterations to the story each subsequent playthrough, like changing small details in the story and providing the player with new choices, which progressively get more and more outlandish. Once this structure was decided, Nagasaka added on to what had already been written, while also injecting a bit of comedy into the game. Asano had written the story fairly seriously, but Nagasaka suggested that even horror stories needed moments of levity. This added humor made it easier for the team to create more variety in tone with the different story paths, and it eventually led to the addition of the pink bookmark. Otogirisou automatically saves the player's progress, which is represented on the main menu as a bookmark. After obtaining a certain number of endings, the bookmark's color will shift to pink, unlocking a bonus scenario full of parodies and raunchy jokes. A goofy extra that would eventually become a staple of the series going forward, with players having to meet certain conditions to obtain bookmarks in all sorts of different colors. Finally, Otogirisou was nearing completion, and Chunsoft was ready to reveal the game to the public. The game had not really been shown to anyone outside the small dev team, so it was a big moment when Chunsoft demonstrated Otogirisou to the media in April 1991. The co-creators of the immensely popular Dragon Quest series were revealing their first original game, so a lot of eyes were on this presentation. Chunsoft proclaimed that Otogirisou was a revolutionary new title that was pioneering an exciting new genre of interactive fiction. But all people saw at the event was plain text on a sepia tone background. At this time, Otogirisou's presentation was just text rendered on top of an image of a book page, with no other visuals outside of some effects here and there. This presentational decision made sense as the game was meant to be a sound novel, but it didn't compare well to the many visually impressive titles that are making their way to Nintendo's new hardware. Because of this, people at the announcement did not receive Otogirisou kindly. Chunsoft's partners expressed their concern with the title's lack of graphics. Wholesalers straight up stated that the game wouldn't sell, and some people in the press told Nakamura that they didn't even think the title was even really a video game. This response was obviously not what the team was hoping for, so it was decided that the game would be delayed past its initial October 1991 release date, in order to replace the blank text-only screens with different background images that would change based on what was happening in the story. This helped give the title a bit more production value, but the press still failed to understand what was so appealing about a book you read on your TV. Upon its initial release in March 1992, outlets like Famitsu gave the game a low 25 out of 40, and sales were nothing to get excited about, with Otogirisou eventually selling about 120,000 copies shortly after its release. A far cry from the millions of copies Dragon Quest V sold later that same year, or even the 700,000 that Portopia managed to achieve a few years prior. But the thing with Otogirisou is that it kept on selling. Back in the early 90s, there were not actually many horror-themed video games available on consoles. Sure, there were titles where the hero fought gruesome foes or that had spooky settings, but there were very few games whose primary goal was to frighten the player. The whole experience of Otogirisou simulated the anticipation of turning the page of a good horror novel, where the player could be met with some kind of new scare every time they pressed a button. This gave the game a certain mystique compared to other titles available in the early days of the Super Famicom. Initial shipments of Otogirisou were pretty low at first, so the game was not widely available, but this only helped increase the title's notoriety as a spooky phantom game that you would only find at your local game store if you were lucky. And the pink bookmark, while a silly extra, also became a famous secret that was highly discussed among players, further helping to spread word about the title. Otogirisou was even a big hit with women.
Actually, there's a game I've wanted to play, or rather watch someone else while they play. It's called SOS. Also Otogirisou.
This was very much by design, as Asano has stated in interviews that one of the team's goals with Otogirisou was to appeal to a female audience, since the industry was very male-oriented at the time. And even before its release, Asano took notice of how Otogirisou was most positively received by young women at trade shows. Because of all this, Otogirisou slowly continued to sell about 10,000 to 20,000 copies every 2 or 3 months. Eventually, after a few reprints, the game reached 300,000 units in total sales. Turns out that Otogirisou had done just what it set out to do. It had slowly attracted an audience that didn't usually play games, and it became a sleeper hit as they began discovering the title. While Otogirisou wasn't a Dragon Quest level seller, the title was finding success. However, while the audience for sound novels was growing, it wouldn't be until the first game's follow-up that the series would truly go mainstream. Otogirisou may have been a sleeper hit, but the next installment would be a true blockbuster. After the release of Otogirisou, much of Chunsoft's staff moved on to work on other projects, such as a Dragon Quest spin-off that would eventually evolve into the company's popular roguelike franchise, Mystery Dungeon. At the same time, plans were also made to create Otogirisou 2. Asano wanted to polish the formula the team had established with their first sound novel, but the concept didn't progress very far, and Chunsoft instead decided to pursue a new idea pitched by Shukei Nagasaka that was far more ambitious. But that project was still quite a ways off. In the meantime, Chunsoft had received a lot of customer survey cards requesting that their next sound novel be a mystery story, so the company decided to also pursue that idea. With the theme in place, Chunsoft began looking for mystery experts that could contribute to the project, and mailed invitations to about 20 different respected novelists in the genre. Apparently, famed author Koji Suzuki was at one point in talks to write this new sound novel, who had just published the first entry in the now famous Ring series. But it wasn't meant to be. Another writer, however, responded back very quickly to Chunsoft's invitation. This man was already familiar with the company's games, and even shared his detailed thoughts about Otogirisou in his response letter. For you see, not only was this man an accomplished author, but he was also a gamer, a rising star in mystery fiction named Takemaru Abiko. Abiko had begun his professional career a few years prior in 1989, and was part of a movement in the world of Japanese mystery fiction known as Shin Honkaku. From the late 80s and into the 90s, there was a wave of young authors that released dozens of popular novels inspired by classical Western mystery fiction, with a heavy focus on giving the reader all the information they needed to piece together the mystery themselves. By 1992, Abiko was an established author in this movement, and was well known for his stories that mixed thrilling mysteries with quirky humor. Along with his writing career, Abiko was also a longtime fan of video games, getting his start playing titles like Lode Runner on the PC back in the 80s. So when Chunsoft contacted him about penning a sequel to Otogirisou, he jumped at the chance, as he had already played and greatly enjoyed the title. Koichi Nakamura was very impressed by Abiko's enthusiastic response, so he got the job, and began working on the project around September 1992, with Kazuya Asano now serving as the director this time around. When Abiko first responded to Chunsoft's letter, he imagined he would be offering some advice on the project, and maybe writing parts of the scenario with a team. After all, even when Nagasaka worked on Otogirisou, he was building off Asano's previous work, along with a handful of writing assistants. But besides a few pieces that were written by Asano, Abiko was going solo with this project, writing the entire scenario pretty much on his own. This meant that Abiko was working on the game almost full-time, and even rented a hotel in Tokyo on a few occasions so he could easily come into Chunsoft's offices on a daily basis, almost like he was a regular employee. Abiko was fully invested in the sound novel, and he even dug deep into his childhood to find inspiration for Otogirisou's follow-up. Way back in the 1960s, a television show called Kaiki Daisaku-san left a lasting impression on Abiko as a kid. The 16th episode featured a group of supernatural investigators trying to find the cause behind a series of deaths where the victims were mysteriously cut up into pieces by seemingly nothing more than a gust of wind. The title of this particular episode was called Kamaitachi, the name of a yokai from Japanese mythology, a weasel-like creature that travels through the wind and attacks people with its sickle-like claws. The episode stuck in Abiko's mind for years afterwards, and even inspired the title of a book he wrote before his professional debut called Kamaitachi no Yoru, the Night of the Kamaitachi. And since Otogirisou had been a horror title, Abiko decided to reference this childhood trauma once again, and outlined a frightening story involving a grisly murder mystery where the victim is cut up into pieces similar to the show. Thus, the game was given the same title as Abiko's unpublished novel, Kamaitachi no Yoru. The protagonist of the story is a college student named Toru, who is on a ski trip in the snowy mountains with his girlfriend, Mari. Mari's uncle and aunt have generously offered to let the two stay at a ski lodge they own nearby called Spur, which is currently housing several other people as well, ranging from an outgoing businessman from Osaka to a trio of young office women. However, the trip suddenly takes a turn for the worse when the office women discover a threatening note left by their door, stating that someone will die at midnight tonight. And sure enough, the pieces of the victim are discovered a few hours later. Now, with the group cut off from the outside world due to a blizzard, it is up to the player to discover the murderer's identity before there are any more deaths at the lodge. Was one of the guests responsible for the crime? Or was it perhaps the work of a yokai, the Kamaitachi? Otogirisou was structured like a ladder, where the player made multiple loops through the system to get different outcomes. Kamaitachi, in comparison, has a flowchart that is much more familiar to modern novel game fans. There are a handful of linear paths that lead to endings where the player identifies the murderer. However, it's unlikely that someone will be able to name the killer unless they first explore the other branches that break off from this main path. During these side tangents, the player can learn new information about the mystery, and then travel back in time, in a sense, to the beginning of the game, where they can then use their newfound knowledge to unmask the murderer. Basically, Otogirisou was like a horror anthology, while Kamaitachi had a solution the player was trying to figure out, not completely dissimilar from the novels of the Shin Honkaku movement. One other big change compared to Otogirisou was Kamaitachi's presentation. with its larger focus on graphical detail and stylistic use of blue silhouetted characters. Chunsoft deliberately chose to not show the characters in their first sound novel, but Abiko believed that this approach would look silly in the sequel. The cast was much larger this time around, so it would be a bit strange if the text was describing that a room was full of characters while the graphics were completely void of people. Therefore, Abiko suggested that the cast be represented as silhouettes, solving this issue while still keeping things vague enough for the player to fill in the details with their imagination. This was more challenging to implement than the staff initially anticipated, however, as the characters could look like unintelligible blobs if they weren't posed very carefully, and the team even went the extra mile to animate the characters in a few key scenes, and these blue silhouettes would be posed and animated against backgrounds that were now made up of digitized photographs. Otogirisou's images were all drawn by hand using pixel art, and Kamaitachi was initially going to do the same thing, as can be seen in early magazine articles. However, the team instead ended up using photographs that were taken at a real-world lodge located in the Nagano prefecture called Knoll, a small mom-and-pop style business that was recommended to Nakamura by a travel agent friend. And for locations that didn't exist at Knoll, such as the wine cellar, the team actually constructed a diorama and took photos of that instead. So, while Kamaitachi's presentation was basically the same as Otogirisou's, these key changes, along with a far more elaborate soundtrack, really stepped up the title's production values and gave the game an iconic look. But outside of its presentation, perhaps the most important difference between Kamaitachi and Otogirisou was hype. While Otogirisou was initially met with confusion by the press, Chunsoft now had an established fanbase that was eagerly anticipating the franchise's next installment. In fact, Kamaitachi often ranked very high in magazine polls for most anticipated future releases. So, after a little over 2 years of development, Kamaitachi no Yoru made its debut on the Super Famicom in November 1994, where it became a smash hit. While Otogirisou had slowly made its way to 300,000, Kamaitachi sold more than twice as much, eventually reaching 750,000 copies sold. Everything just clicked into place for Kamaitachi, and the game quickly became one of Chunsoft's biggest titles outside of Dragon Quest. And it wasn't just Chunsoft's previous success that led to the title blowing up. The end of 1994 just so happened to be the perfect time to release a mystery-themed work like Kamaitachi. As stated previously, Abiko was part of a movement in Japanese mystery fiction that saw a lot of authors publishing novels that helped popularize traditional mystery stories with a modern audience. This period also saw manga like Detective Conan and the Kendaichi case files establish a huge presence in Japanese pop culture. Mystery fiction in general was just going through a renaissance in Japan, and Kamaitachi no Yoru dropped right in the middle of this mania. In some ways, it couldn't help but be successful. Regardless of what led to its popularity, sound novels had now proven that they were no longer a niche experimental genre. They were a mainstream hit, and other companies quickly took notice. Now that Chunsoft had perfected the sound novel formula, it was easy for other developers to imitate their style. All they needed was a writer, sound, and some background images. The first to jump on the bandwagon was Athena, who published Yokochu in 1995, a sound novel about a sea captain whose boat is being plagued with all manner of bizarre incidents during a long voyage. The title was released only a few months after Kamaitachi no Yoru, and it signaled the opening of the floodgates. Soon, an assortment of notable and not so notable publishers and developers were trying their hand at the sound novel genre. Banpresto made a title about kids sharing scary schoolyard rumors. Hudson created an anthology of short horror stories for the PC Engine CD. Pack-In Video produced a title based on the novels of Jiro Akagawa. Warp developed a sound novel that quite literally was only made up of sound. Capcom published a duology of games about a female bounty hunter, and even Nintendo distributed a little-known sound novel for their Satellaview service. Throughout the later half of the 90s and into the 2000s, dozens of other creators would make their own interpretations of the sound novel formula. Chunsoft had caused an adventure game boom with Portopia back on the Famicom, an RPG boom with Dragon Quest, and now they had done it once again and created a sound novel boom. With the sound novel now established as the exciting new genre Chunsoft had initially advertised it as, it was time for them to go big. The next generation of video game consoles were right around the corner. A new era of the game industry was approaching, and developers were preparing to create some of their most ambitious titles yet, and Chunsoft was no different. The company's third sound novel would be a massive game that would go on to be one of Chunsoft's most critically acclaimed titles. But the game industry is a fickle beast, and Chunsoft was soon to make a massive miscalculation. One day, Shukei Nagasaka was in a phone booth in Shibuya, Tokyo, an area world famous for its large crossing that sees hundreds of people passing by one another on a daily basis. In this booth, Nagasaka's call was interrupted by someone slamming on the door, yelling that they urgently needed to use the phone. This experience got Nagasaka thinking. In this person's eyes, he was nothing more than a random old man getting in the way of their important phone call, while Nagasaka saw it the other way around. Following this train of thought, he realized that every person is simultaneously the main character of their own story, while also playing a supporting role in someone else's. But what if you could hop between these different perspectives? What if you could experience the stories of dozens of people and see how their lives all affect one another in small ways? What if a story had as many protagonists as there were people on the Shibuya crossing? Soon after Otogirisou's launch in 1992, Koichi Nakamura asked Nagasaka to pitch him on some ideas for Chunsoft's next sound novel, and the one that caught Nakamura's attention was a concept inspired by his phone booth incident. A pitch for a sound novel that didn't just follow the story of one or two people in an enclosed space, but 100 individuals across the entire city of Shibuya over the course of a whole week. This was an idea that would be right at home on a CD-ROM. In the early 90s, the CD format was starting to come into prominence, which afforded developers far more storage space compared to cartridges. And Nakamura saw this idea for a game with 100 main characters as the perfect concept to take advantage of all those extra megabytes. So, the project was greenlit in 1992, and the initial contracts for the title simply called the game New CD-ROM Work. But Nagasaka already had a more specific name in mind for the game, which would end up being its final title, the kanji character for city or town, which simply reads as Machi. During the early stages of development, Nagasaka assured Nakamura that it would only take him and his team of writers about 3 months to draft up Machi's scenario. However, that was incredibly hopeful thinking. The scenario would end up taking several years to write, let alone months, with 20 writers contributing to the title at one point in development, a small army compared to the only handful of people that penned the previous 2 sound novels. Chunsoft would produce Kamaitachi in the meantime as work continued on the project, and Machi's writing team would eventually shrink down to a core group of 5 people, including Nagasaka. Each writer was assigned to specific characters, with Nagasaka supervising all of their work, making sure everything fit together. However, it became clear over time that creating 100 fully fleshed out scenarios would be an impossible task to achieve in a reasonable amount of time. So, Machi was streamlined a bit. Instead of 1 week, the game would now take place over the course of 5 days, and instead of 100 playable protagonists, that number would be cut down to 50, then 30, before finally landing on 8. And these final characters were Keima Amamiya, a gamer detective who must use his skills in both professions to investigate a bomb threat being orchestrated by an elusive mastermind. Masami Ushio, a former Yakuza that is mistaken to be an actor and must now play along with the misunderstanding so he can hide from the police. Jintaro Umabe, an inept TV actor who is trying to do right by his first major role, but is mistaken to be the former Yakuza and now must play along if he wants to live. Fumiyasu Ichikawa, a writer who has no memory of creating the scripts that have made him famous, all of which seem to have been composed while dreaming of horrific nightmares. Masashi Shinoda, an average college student that is coerced by a mysterious woman known as Sunday into joining a bizarre organization whose goal is to blackmail people out of their money. Ryuji Takamine, an ex-soldier in the French Foreign Legion, haunted by flashbacks of his gruesome past and fearful of his uncontrollable love for violence. Yoshiko Hisoi, a lovey-dovey foodie that is trying out every weight loss gimmick in the book to shave off a few kilograms in order to win back the love of her body-shaming boyfriend. Yohei Tobisawa, a high school ladies' man who is forced to face the consequences of his playboy lifestyle when one of his girlfriends announces she is pregnant. All of these seemingly unrelated people live out their own adventures alongside one another, and the player has the ability to jump into their perspectives in order to make choices that change their actions. And while Chunsoft's previous sound novels had been horror mysteries, the stories of each character in Machi are presented in all sorts of different genres that match their specific personalities, from sleep-deprived surrealism to slapstick comedy. What also made Machi unique compared to other sound novels was the fact that each character technically had a linear narrative that led to a single conclusion. While the game does have a large number of endings, these are basically just game overs, not completely different story paths like in past Chunsoft titles. Instead of drastically changing the narrative, the player makes choices in order to remove barriers to progression, because decisions made as one character can have a positive or negative effect on the narratives of the other 7 protagonists. For example, say Ryuji gets into a fight in an alleyway, and Keima witnesses the crime, so he arrests Ryuji. This event would lead to a bad ending for Ryuji, and the player would no longer be able to progress his story. However, if the player swaps to Keima's perspective and chooses to ignore the fight, then the player can jump back to Ryuji and continue his story without any issues. Sometimes a character's scenario will also be put on pause after encountering a to be continued screen. These force the player to explore other characters' routes in order to jump past these barriers through a system called zapping. Basically, if 2 characters walk by each other or are otherwise mentioned in someone else's storyline, then the text describing that character will be highlighted in green. The player can then select this text and swap to their perspective, which will force the character's scenario to progress. Zap prompts can also be found hidden inside tips, text highlighted in blue that reveal additional details about certain terminology when they are selected by the player. Overall, the goal of Machi is to use all these different mechanics to remove various roadblocks until all 8 protagonists are able to reach the end of the day, eventually leading to the game's conclusion on the 5th day. This structure is quite different from Chunsoft's previous 2 sound novels. Instead of the player navigating a more traditional flowchart or repeating a loop to get different results, the experience of playing Machi feels more like the player is unraveling various strings in a tangled ball of yarn. Along with this change in structure, Machi also had a very different presentation. Kamaitachi had used photographs for its backgrounds, but Machi went the full 9 yards, with the entire game being made up of pictures and videos of hundreds of performers. This ambitious choice of presentation was decided by Koichi Nakamura himself, who surprisingly came to the decision out of convenience more than anything else. Nakamura believed that representing the characters as silhouettes would get confusing with a game of this scale, and it would be too time-consuming to render every character as a more detailed illustration. Thus, Nakamura decided that live action was the perfect solution, as it would allow them to create hundreds of images without needing to draw each individual frame. And so, 3 teams eventually set out to film Machi in October 1996, but the production was far from easy. Machi was created before digital cameras were commonplace, so the film crew had to take photos on set, get the photos developed, and then send them to the dev team to get digitized. If the photos didn't look right in the game itself, retakes had to be filmed, and the whole process was started all over again. It was very time-consuming, and the film crew were basically working non-stop over the course of about 40 days, with many people only getting 3 hours of sleep each day. When development finished, the final game would be made up of a staggering 6,000 photographs, capturing the performances of almost 400 different people, including TV stars, comedians, voice actors, complete unknowns, and even Chunsoft staff. It was a massive production, and Nakamura would later joke that it may have ultimately been easier if they had just created illustrations instead. But the results spoke for themselves. Unlike many contemporary FMV games, which were often shot in front of a blue screen on a soundstage, a majority of Machi was filmed on location at different landmarks throughout Shibuya. This gave the game a real sense of authenticity, and in the years to follow, the game would inadvertently serve as a nostalgic time capsule, a snapshot of what Shibuya was like in the mid-90s, with many of the game's iconic landmarks no longer existing in the city even a year after its filming. Everything was coming together. If Otogirisou was a prototype of the sound novel genre, and Kamaitachi no Yoru was that formula fully realized, then Machi was the AAA sound novel epic, an example of the genre pushing itself to the limit in terms of scope. And when Machi was finally shown off to the public in February 1997, Chunsoft revealed that the game would actually be the first of many titles in a planned franchise. The team had spent so much time fleshing out the world of Machi that they had enough material to fill multiple sequels, with the goal of eventually reaching 100 playable protagonists across all the different installments, just like Nagasaka's original pitch. The way this would have worked is that every background character in Machi was given enough backstory and personality that they could potentially return as a protagonist in a Machi sequel. Chunsoft even spoke of plans to allow fans to get involved in the production of future entries by contributing story ideas or even appearing in the games themselves as actors. Machi was shaping up to be Chunsoft's most ambitious title ever, and there was a lot riding on its success. During the announcement event, Nakamura even jokingly stated that he hoped that Machi would be so successful that it would sell more copies than there were Sega Saturns currently in the market. That's right, the Saturn, the platform Machi was exclusively launching on. All of Chunsoft's sound novels had previously been developed for Nintendo hardware, but Machi had been specifically designed for the CD format, and Nintendo's console for that generation was sticking with cartridges. So Nakamura met with representatives from both Sega and Sony early in Machi's development to see which of Nintendo's CD-based competitors would end up housing their ambitious project. Out of the two, Sega was the most receptive to Chunsoft's pitch. Not only did the company's vice president agree to help market the title, but during their first meeting, he even went out of his way to get Machi permission to film at Sega's arcades and major department stores he had contacts at. This strong support won Nakamura over, and thus, Machi became a Sega Saturn exclusive. And when Machi finally launched on store shelves in January 1998, it hit the market with positive buzz from the press. One critic stated that Machi had elevated the sound novel genre to another level, and the game would go on to win the award for Best Scenario at the 3rd Annual Computer Entertainment Software Academy Awards, known today as the Japan Game Awards. Machi would also garner a dedicated following, with the game still being lauded with praise even years after its release. In polls conducted by Famitsu, Machi ranked as the 5th best video game of all time in 2006, and in 2017, it was listed as one of the best adventure games ever created. In terms of critical reception and long-lasting appeal, Machi was incredibly successful, and it is often thought of as a shining example of the sound novel genre, an iconic part of the Saturn's legacy. and one of Chunsoft's greatest works. But the numbers told a different story. In a sad twist of fate, Machi's reception was the complete opposite of Otogirisou. The title was drowning in critical praise, but it bombed in terms of sales. The game's high production values and over 5-year development cycle meant that it was significantly more expensive to produce compared to the company's previous sound novels, and yet it only managed to sell a meager 83,000 copies within its first year on the market. Back when Machi first began filming, there was still no clear winner in the console race, but by 1998, the PlayStation was by far the more successful platform, and the Saturn's smaller install base certainly contributed to Machi's lower sales. It also didn't help that Machi just so happened to launch on the very same day as a highly anticipated dating sim on the Saturn, a title that was marketed as a Tokimeki memorial killer called Sentimental Graffiti. Gal games like this were especially popular with the Saturn's hardcore audience in Japan, and Sentimental Graffiti would go on to crush Machi in terms of sales. However, Machi was too big to fail. It had to be. If Machi 1 didn't sell, how could Chunsoft justify making a Machi 2, 3, and 4 like they had planned? Therefore, Chunsoft quickly began doing damage control and pivoted hard into supporting the PlayStation. They did this by basically reintroducing the entire sound novel franchise to the PlayStation audience, by bringing Otogirisou, Kamaitachi no Yoru, and Machi to the PS1 under a new label called Sound Novel Evolution. These were all welcomed re-releases that added some nice quality of life features, such as an interactive flowchart that made it easier for players to jump around to different branching points in the story. But despite all this, Machi's total sales still only amounted to around 250,000 copies as of 2012, and that's only after it was also ported to the PlayStation Portable in 2006. According to some sources, it wasn't until said PSP port was released that Machi even managed to recoup its development costs, 8 years after its initial release. For the first time in his career, Koichi Nakamura had hit a wall. He was at a loss on how to process Chunsoft's first major flop. If Machi had been poorly received, he would have been able to accept the poor sales, but he was proud of the title, and it was praised by pretty much everyone. So why wasn't it selling? Players were wowed by Otogirisou and Kamaitachi because horror games were a rarity at the time. Playing a game on consoles with kanji was a rarity. Advanced soundscapes were a rarity. But now all of these elements were commonplace, and there wasn't much to differentiate Machi at first glance from any other random sound novels that were now flooding the market. The game's minimalist packaging on the Saturn certainly didn't help draw people's eyes to the title either. Additionally, the game's visuals might have actually hurt the game more than aided it. Live-action graphics were an exciting new innovation in the early 90s, but they were no longer in vogue by the end of the decade, due to many cheesy and outright bad FMV titles souring people's perception of the graphical style. Nakamura would even later state in interviews that he wished that Machi had been released a lot sooner, then maybe it could have changed people's bias against live-action video games. Maybe it was its visuals, maybe it was changes in the market, maybe it was just the simple fact that Machi wasn't a horror mystery like Chunsoft's previous sound novels. Whatever the reason, the company's grand ambitions for the Machi franchise had died on the vine. This failed release marked the first major stumbling block for the sound novel series, but Chunsoft's staff still had a lot of faith in these digital novels and would spend the early 2000s struggling to keep them relevant. After the sales failure of Machi, creating a sequel to Kamaitachi no Yoru was an obvious next step for the sound novel franchise. Chunsoft's Sound Novel Evolution label didn't catch the world on fire, but it did prove one thing: Kamaitachi was still a hot property, with the PlayStation port selling a healthy 400,000 copies. The sequel, unsurprisingly called Kamaitachi no Yoru 2, initially began development on the PS1, but eventually found its way into players' hands in July 2002, where it launched on Sony's next generation of hardware, the PlayStation 2. The blue silhouettes would return, but this time, Chunsoft would take advantage of the PS2's DVD format to present the game through a combination of high-resolution CGI animation and real-world photography. The title was a true mixture of different mediums, with people from across the industry and beyond contributing to the project's presentation. For example, the title's art direction was handled by a talent from the Japanese film industry named Yohei Tanida, who later famously worked on the first volume of Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill duology and The Hateful Eight. The various CG images in the game were also supervised by Haruhiko Shono, a digital artist known for his avant-garde work with computer graphics, and for creating several video games in the early 90s. The sequel's strong focus on visuals should come as no surprise, since the title was directed by Shinya Ochiai, who had previously been a graphic designer on many past Chunsoft titles, including Kamaitachi 1. But graphics are only one piece of what makes up a compelling sound novel. What about Kamaitachi 2's story? This is where things get a little strange. The premise of Kamaitachi no Yoru 2 sees Toru, Mari, and many other returning characters traveling to a remote private island where they have been invited to stay at a lavish villa. But this exciting vacation takes a turn for the worse when the characters start to be murdered one by one as they desperately try to find a way off the island that has now become their prison. The premise sounds pretty typical for a sequel. The snowy mountain has just been swapped out for a warmer setting. But the part that makes it strange is the fact that the cast are invited to the island by none other than Takimaru Abiko, the real-world author of the original game. In the world of the sequel, Abiko was trapped at Spur with the other characters, but in the real incident, there were no murders at the ski lodge. However, Abiko would later produce a murder mystery video game inspired by this experience, also called Kamaitachi no Yoru, and the game's cast was based on the real people Abiko met at Spur. So, after Kamaitachi became a big hit, Abiko invited everyone to vacation at his mansion as thanks for letting him use their likenesses, with even some of the game's dev team also tagging along. This self-referential setup was actually conceived by Abiko himself, the real one, not the one in-game. When Koichi Nakamura first began making plans to develop Kamaitachi 2, he approached Abiko to discuss what a sequel needed to include to truly feel like a continuation of the first game. Abiko suggested that the story had to be set in an environment that was cut off from the outside world, and that the main characters needed to return as protagonists. However, it was difficult to make a sequel with the same cast without establishing some kind of canon ending to Kamaitachi 1. That's when Abiko came up with this meta premise as a solution to this conundrum. The original Kamaitachi no Yoru certainly had its fair share of meta elements, but the sequel was putting all that stuff front and center, for better and for worse. Kamaitachi 2 would become somewhat famous over the years for its fourth-wall-breaking storytelling, but many players who loved the first game disliked how the title was written off as if it never really happened. Some people even went as far as to create fan games that ignored Chunsoft's sequel and told their own continuation of the original title. Outside of 2's meta premise, some players were also dissatisfied with how easy the core mystery was to figure out, as the sequel placed more importance on telling a linear horror story rather than allowing the player to do any actual crime solving. For example, in Kamaitachi 1, the player had the ability to save most of the characters if they made good decisions early on, but this element of interactivity was removed in Kamaitachi 2. Certain characters are just going to die no matter what the player does. Additionally, although Abiko technically starred in the game, he didn't actually write the main scenario itself, instead only penning 2 of the game's bonus scenarios. Abiko felt that he had put everything he had into the original Kamaitachi and was now out of ideas, so a team of other writers fleshed out the sequel's narrative instead. Some players enjoyed the story crafted by these new writers, but many others also missed the charms of Abiko's prose. So while Kamaitachi 2 still had its fans, and the presentation was universally praised, the game wasn't the slam dunk Chunsoft had hoped for, and the game's mixed reception was reflected in its sales. Kamaitachi 2 was heavily promoted by Chunsoft, and a made-for-TV movie based on the first game was even produced to coincide with the title's launch. Sadly, the sequel still only ended up selling around 350,000 copies. Those numbers may not sound that bad, but Chunsoft had invested a lot of time and money into creating the sequel's unique visuals, with the team spending 2.5 years purely on producing the title's graphics. This meant that the game was a fairly expensive production, and yet it failed to perform even as well as the original's recent PS1 port. The staff at Chunsoft were devastated by this outcome, and to make matters worse, Kazuya Asano would end up leaving Chunsoft later that same year. After serving as Machi's director a few years prior, and Kamaitachi 2's supervising director, all of Asano's current projects had come to an end. So he felt that it was the right time to move on to other opportunities. The separation seems to have been amicable, however, as Asano would later work again with Koichi Nakamura and Chunsoft as a freelancer. But even so, Asano was a man that was often labeled as the father of the sound novel franchise, and had been deeply involved with every game up to this point, so his departure was a big loss for the series. After the 1-2 punch of Machi, and now Kamaitachi's sequel, the sound novel franchise would go silent for the next handful of years, as Chunsoft seemingly put all of their sound novel plans on hold. An unannounced sequel to Otogirisou was even cancelled behind the scenes, which had been in development around the same time as Kamaitachi 2. From the outside, the series may have seemed as if it was done and dusted, but in reality, the franchise was soon to attempt a big comeback, all thanks to the return of an old ally, and the hire of a new employee, an aspiring filmmaker, designer, and storyteller named Jiro Ishii. Ever since Ishii was a child, he had big dreams of creating his own stories, but he often changed his mind on which medium he wanted to work in. In elementary school, he wanted to become a manga author or anime director, and in high school, he wanted to create live-action films. But after graduation, he somewhat randomly ended up working part-time at a game developer named Data West. At the studio, Ishii designed a Blade Runner-inspired adventure game called Imitation City in 1987. But the experience left Ishii frustrated by the many limitations he faced on the project. And so, Ishii left the game industry just as quickly as he had entered it, and spent the next decade hopping between different careers. Eventually, however, he found his way back to games after getting a job directing PC titles at Nikkei Video Bank in the mid-90s. Games had changed a lot since the 80s, and Ishii was inspired to re-enter the industry after playing ambitious CD-ROM titles like Spaceship Warlock, and the surreal experiences created by the aforementioned Haruhiko Shona. Chunsoft's sound novels also played a big part in Ishii's revived interest in video games. The way titles like Kamaitachi no Yoru were able to tell complex branching narratives impressed Ishii a great deal, and after Nikkei chose to leave the game industry at the end of the 90s, Ishii decided to join Chunsoft in the year 2000, where he hoped to work on his own entries in the sound novel series. In fact, Ishii was actually hired specifically to direct the aforementioned sequel to Otogirisou, but after that project fell through, his sound novel ambitions were put on hold. Afterwards, Ishii would go on to produce the critically acclaimed Sannen bi Gumi Kenpachi Sensei in 2004, as part of a company-wide initiative to produce original titles for Chunsoft's 20th anniversary. The The PS2 game was based on a popular television drama of the same name, about a teacher who guides his students through academia by helping them with their studies as well as their personal struggles. The game helped establish Ishii as a notable director at Chunsoft, but he had still not fulfilled his reason for joining the company in the first place, to make a sound novel. But all that was about to change. After Kenpachi-sensei's release, Koichi Nakamura invited Ishii to work on the sound novel series once again, thanks to a new partnership with Sega. After Machi's launch on the Saturn, Sega and Chunsoft continued to have a strong working relationship. In fact, Sega had just recently helped Chunsoft publish the much-beloved Shiren the Wanderer Gaiden on the Dreamcast in 2002. This led to Sega approaching Chunsoft about forming a partnership in the mid-2000s, where they would help fund and publish several of their future titles. Chunsoft's financial situation at this time was actually in a very dire state, with the company even asking some employees to voluntarily leave or accept lower wages. Thankfully, the hugely successful launch of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon a few years later would help Chunsoft get back on their feet, but the company's financial woes might explain why Sega stepped in to help them out around this period. The collaboration with Sega was eventually announced to the public in 2005 as the Sega Cross Chun project, and several games were revealed to be in production, including a number of sound novels. This includes some ports of past titles, as well as a few brand new installments and sequels. The first of these new sound novels was released in 2006, and was the third entry in the Kamaitachi series, called Kamaitachi no Yoru Triple. The game was spearheaded by 2's director, Shinya Ochiai, who outlined a story that saw the player jumping between the perspectives of 4 different returning characters, who set out to resolve the remaining mysteries left lingering after the events of 2's true ending. The game was initially intended to be a small budget release that also saw the return of Takimaru Abiko as the lead scenario writer, after he had turned down the role during 2's production. But as Triple's narrative was fleshed out, the game's scope started to increase, and Sega also encouraged the team to not exclude any content players would expect from a new Kamaitachi title, such as the fan favorite Pink Bookmark. In the end, the game would become a fully featured numbered sequel that served as a capstone to the Kamaitachi subseries. And not only did it include the third entry, but it also contained ports of Kamaitachi 2 and 1, making the game an anthology of the whole series thus far. Alongside Kamaitachi Triple, Jiro Ishii and his team were put in charge of developing 2 other larger projects that were meant to be indirect follow-ups to past sound novels. The first of these revivals to make it to market was Imabikiso, a spiritual sequel to Otogirisou that reused many of the concepts that were initially planned for the cancelled sequel. The game follows a college student who's investigating strange deaths that had been occurring at his campus, all of which are somehow connected to a new drug called Vision, which is created from a mysterious flower known as the Imabikiso. The title was released for the newly launched PlayStation 3 in 2007, and represented a few different firsts for the franchise. Not only was it the first entry to be produced in widescreen for an HD console, but it was also the first installment in the series to feature voice acting. The way this worked was rather interesting. Instead of voiced lines appearing as text on screen, all spoken dialogue was only conveyed through audio, so the player would listen to someone speak while the text itself described the scene. And this audio soundscape was further enhanced with support for surround sound setups, another first for the series. The sound novel franchise had laid dormant for almost half a decade, but now it was back in full force. Kamaitachi Triple was seen as a positive end to the trilogy to help repair some of the more controversial elements of 2. And Imabikiso was also positively received as a fun horror title that really leaned into the J-horror aesthetics of the 2000s. All of these new releases and ports were enjoyed by fans, But at the same time, none of them really blew up the charts. However, Sega and Chunsoft's final sound novel from their partnership would end up leaving a lasting impression on players. A game that is still celebrated to this day and that received perfect marks from big publications at the time. The second revival project produced by Jiro Ishii, Chunsoft's follow-up to Machi. The setting is Shibuya, Tokyo. A young woman has been kidnapped. The criminals demand that her sister deliver a briefcase full of ransom money to the iconic Hachiko statue. On this day, the fates of 5 individuals will cross as the harrowing events of this kidnapping unfold. Shinya Kano, an inexperienced detective assigned to the kidnapping case. Achi Endo, a former gang leader that now spends his days picking up trash and fighting injustice. Tama, a woman trapped in a fursuit with no memory of who she is. Kenji Osawa, a reclusive scientist and father of the woman who was kidnapped. Minoru Minorikawa, a scrappy former reporter that is dragged back into the profession to help his former mentor. Just who are these kidnappers, and what is their motivation? The answers to all these mysteries will be solved by these 5 protagonists, whether they realize it or not. While Machi had not been a financial success, the title had maintained a strong fanbase over the years, and Koichi Nakamura himself had been wanting to revisit the title for a long time. Turns out that Sega felt the same way. So when the Sega Cross Chun project first began, the two companies discussed the possibility of producing a new live-action sound novel. It was no longer possible to make the direct sequel to Machi Chunsoft had originally planned. So it was decided to instead create a brand new title that would serve as a spiritual continuation. And so, Jiro Ishii was given the responsibility of realizing this exciting revival in 2004, and he quickly went to work along with the team he had established while making Kenpachi Sensei. Even Kenpachi's scenario writer, a freelancer named Yukinori Kitajima, would return at the request of Ishii. The two had formed a strong working relationship while developing Kenpachi, as Ishii could trust Kitajima to flesh out even the vaguest of suggestions, and Kitajima enjoyed the freedom to contribute unconventional ideas to Ishii's games. Similar to its original inspiration, Machi's spiritual sequel would feature many different types of people and tones across its story. However, while Machi's title had been decided early in development, Chunsoft struggled for years to nail down a name that could encapsulate the diverse drama they were assembling. Among all the names they proposed, the one that stood out to Ishii the most was 428. This unique moniker was suggested because, due to some Japanese wordplay, it could sound similar to Shibuya. Ishii liked that the title was a number, similar to TV shows like 24, and Nakamura was a fan of the pun. Thus, the game was ultimately titled 428 in a blockaded Shibuya. As one would expect, 428 would inherit a lot of the structure and gameplay of the original Machi. The narrative, obviously, once again took place in Shibuya, where the player has to overcome roadblocks by zapping between the different cast members. But the game wouldn't just be a carbon copy. When Jiro Ishii first began developing 428, he told the game's director, "Make 428 like a rhythm game." Ishii believed that the key to keeping a player engaged in a sound novel or adventure game was establishing a sense of rhythm with the sound, visuals, and even the timing of the button presses. The story could be amazing, but if the game didn't have a satisfying beat, the experience would fall flat, similar to a rhythm game. So to enhance this sense of rhythm, 428 was designed to have a fast-paced narrative full of action and quick beats. Machi could often be slow and methodical, but not 428. Ishii wanted this title to feel like a season of an exciting TV show, again like 24, where the characters are all under the pressure of a deadline. The game would still have its slower moments, but Ishii's goal was to make everything snappier and more concise. In this spirit, the story would now take place over the course of a single day, instead of 5 like Machi, with every hour ticking down to the story's conclusion. The cast was also cut down to 5 playable characters instead of 8, and unlike the cast members in Machi, the protagonist's routes would all lead to the same ending. Ishii believed that Machi could often feel like a lonely game. Each person in the cast was very disconnected from each other, because the player basically had to make choices to stop the characters from interfering with each other. But in the case of 428, the game was designed so that it could only progress if the characters are brought together, making the game feel like a funnel where everyone eventually takes part in the final conclusion. Once all of this was decided, a production crew set out to film 428, where they spent 60 days running around to different locations throughout Shibuya. And I mean literally run. Filming is actually prohibited in Shibuya, so 428 had a guerrilla-style production, where the crew had to remain one step ahead of the police, something the original team on Machi also had to contend with. On top of that, the city of Shibuya is always changing, so the scripts sometimes had to be rewritten on the fly due to real-world renovations. Filming in the city was so difficult, in fact, that the production crew tried to convince Chunsoft to set more of their scenes in locations outside the city, but in the end, most of the filming ended up taking place in Shibuya. And the team had to contend with all of these difficulties while organizing a huge number of performers. Once all was said and done, the team had taken over 120,000 photos, which took Chunsoft several months to sort through as they decided which shots would make it into the final game. Outside of the filming, 428's development was also a great example of Jiro Ishii's love of collaboration. Ishii had a history of getting fairly well-known talent from other industries to contribute to his projects. For example, Makoto Tezuka, the son of Osamu Tezuka, was brought on to help with Ishii's first game at Nikkei Video Bank, and Kenpachi-sensei's character designs were handled by Satoko Morikawa, a famed animator that had just come off working on Studio Ghibli's The Cat Returns. And just the same, Ishii pulled a similar stunt with 428. First and foremost, 428 saw the return of some familiar faces, such as Takimaru Abiko, who was brought on to pen a heartbreaking side story for the game. Outside of Chunsoft's usual suspects, an award-winning composer named Naoki Sato was invited to write a large portion of 428's soundtrack. Sato has worked on everything from TV anime to creating music for the 2020 Olympics, but he is perhaps most famous for working with director Takashi Yamazaki, composing many of his film scores, including 2023's Godzilla -1. And finally, perhaps most famous of all, Kinoko Natsu and Takashi Takeuchi, the founders of Type Moon, were brought on to create a prequel story for an important side character known as Kanan. Type Moon was a rising star within the otaku fandom of the early 2000s, who were famous at the time for creating light novels, fighting games, and, most of all, producing an incredibly popular visual novel known as Tsukihime. Jiro Ishii had become drinking buddies with Type Moon's founders, and managed to recruit them to work on 428 very early in the title's development. This was a huge get, as Type Moon was just beginning to really blow up in the mainstream thanks to the recent release of Fate Stay Night in 2004, a visual novel that would eventually grow into a multimedia juggernaut. And not only did Natsu write the scenario for Kanan's side story, but Takeuchi even designed the characters, with the entire scenario presented in his iconic illustration style. Chunsoft was so excited about Type Moon's work that they almost developed Kanen's story into an entirely separate full-length game. However, that would have conflicted too much with Type Moon's other projects, so it remained as only a bonus scenario. But Kanen's story would later continue in a 13-episode anime in 2009, which served as a sequel of sorts to 428. On top of all of these outside contributors, Chunsoft's internal staff had also been perfecting the art of making sound novels for over a decade, and were perhaps at the peak of their powers while developing 428. And thanks to all of that accumulated knowledge, the team was able to create one of their most polished experiences yet. With all of these people lending their talents to the project, it was almost like the past, present, and future of the sound novel genre were coming together to create something truly special. Jiro Ishii would even later state that if he could travel back in time and make 428 all over again with his current knowledge, he would still make the exact same game. The team really put everything they had into making 428, and Chunsoft knew they had a monumental release on their hands, a sound novel that could perhaps surpass all of their past work. Finally, on December 4th, 2008, at 4:28 p.m., the singer of 428's main theme performed a mini concert in front of Shibuya's iconic 109 building to celebrate the game's launch. 428's release felt like a true celebration, and the fans that night weren't the only ones that thought so. Famously, 428 received a perfect score from Famitsu upon its release, which helped attract a lot of buzz around the title. It was only the 9th game in the magazine's story history to be awarded a perfect 40 out of 40, ranking it among titles like Ocarina of Time, Metal Gear Solid 4, Soul Calibur, and Nintendogs. Looking back, Famitsu may have been more than a little biased in their assessment, as they literally participated in the game's development, but they were only one of many outlets that were singing 428's praises. Across the board, 428 garnered glowing reviews from fans and critics alike, and just like Machi, it has continued to be lauded with accolades to this day, ranking as one of the best adventure games of all time in many Japanese fan polls and lists. Many people within the industry also praised 428 upon its release, and Jiro Ishii later claimed that the developers of a certain large-scale RPG series had even begun using 428 to teach their staff how to write game scenarios. Not only had Chunsoft produced a worthy successor to Machi, but they created a title that truly stood as one of the pinnacles of its genre as a whole. But then there were the sales. 428 and Machi shared a lot of similarities, and the title's return on investment was sadly another aspect they had in common. Otogirisou and 428 were both developed almost in tandem with each other, with no clear platform in mind. They were constructed in HD on PCs, and then ported to whichever console Chunsoft thought best suited the title. When Otogirisou launched on the PlayStation 3 the year prior, Chunsoft noted that the game didn't have much reach outside the hardcore fanbase, and decided to bring 428 to Nintendo's Wii instead, to hopefully attract the platform's more casual and potentially much larger audience. However, it seems that the Wii was also not a great fit for Chunsoft's sound novels, with sources estimating that the title only sold around 65,000 copies by August 2009. Again, just like with Machi, the disparity between 428's critical reception and its financial reception was incredibly vast. Soon after 428's flop on the Wii, Sega's partnership with Chunsoft came to an end, and the company would go on to team up with another developer called Spike to release ports of 428 on every platform that could run it. According to data shared by Chunsoft in 2012, 428's total sales of every port on all platforms eventually amounted to around 260,000 copies. It seems that 428 had continued to sell over time, but it still only managed to just barely recoup the money spent on its development. Jiro Ishii stated in pre-release interviews that he believed that 428 could be a big hit with the type of casual users that enjoyed games like Wii Sports and Wii Fit. But that clearly ended up not being the case. One of the reasons for this outcome might have to do with the fact that many of the title's selling points seemed more aimed at a hardcore crowd. 428 was a spiritual sequel to a beloved yet niche Sega Saturn game, and it was heavily advertised that Type Moon was contributing to the title, which was squarely aimed at otaku. And during the early 2000s, many of these more savvy customers were now simply going to sites like Nico Nico and YouTube, where they could just watch playthroughs of games like 428 and enjoy the story free of charge. Jiro Ishii was not a fan of this trend, and infamously made a tweet in 2010 where he expressed his displeasure that a video playthrough of 428 had gained more views than the game itself had actually sold. Regardless, whatever reason actually led to its poor sales, 428 just seemed to have a hard time finding an audience that both found the game appealing and was willing to actually pay for it. Chunsoft had put everything they had into 428, but sadly, for one reason or another, it still wasn't enough. For all intents and purposes, the market failure of 428 was the final straw for the sound novel franchise. Chunsoft would never again achieve the same critical success they obtained with 428, and the series would begin its descent into irrelevance. But nonetheless, Chunsoft would persevere and attempt to recover from 428's poor sales by trying to modernize the sound novel formula and even localize their titles for other regions. Over the next decade, Chunsoft would focus heavily on developing sequels and ports to Kamaitachi no Yoru, as it was by far the sound novel with the most cultural cachet. This began with a reboot for the PlayStation 3 and Vita in 2011, called Shin Kamaitachi no Yoru. The title had a similar snowy mountain setting to the first game, but featured a totally new cast, who are now presented in real-time 3D graphics instead of the pre-rendered CG from previous installments. New investigative elements were also added to help give the title a bit more interactivity, and Kazuya Asano, along with Takimaru Abiko, returned to assist on writing the title. But sadly, this reimagining received a mixed reception from fans, and did not seem to perform very well. After this release, Chunsoft then tried to re-establish their sound novel series on smartphones. Chunsoft had already created a few ports of their sound novels for the mobile market, but in 2013, the company published a remake of the original Kamaitachi no Yoru under a new label called Smart Sound Novel. This version featured new high-resolution photographs of Knoll, but sadly removed the franchise's iconic blue silhouettes in order to have the game look more like a digital ebook. The script was also rewritten to take place in modern-day Japan, and other small details were also altered, such as Toru and Mari now snowboarding on their trip instead of skiing. A few more entries in the Smart Sound Novel series would make their way to the App Store, but it's hard to say how successful they were, and the label has since fallen out of use. Then, yet another remake of Kamaitachi was released in 2017 for the PlayStation Vita and later PC, which tried to heavily rework the game's presentation. Chunsoft teamed up with 5PB, creators of the famous science adventure series, to basically reimagine Kamaitachi as a Bishoujo-style visual novel called Kamaitachi no Yoru Rinne Saisei. The silhouetted characters were once again removed and replaced with illustrations drawn by Alpha, an artist most well known for their character designs on other beloved visual novels, such as Sharon no Kuni. However, the presentation was so different compared to past entries that fans reacted very negatively to the release online, and the game's artist would even be harassed until they eventually posted an apology for their work on Twitter. It was a horrible situation for all involved. Another avenue Chunsoft explored was localizing their sound novels for audiences outside Japan.
So we're here to introduce and share our vision of sound novel. So it is part ebook that draws the audience into an immersive, compelling storyline that also integrates graphics and audio to enhance the experience. Furthermore, it is also a game because it engages the reader into making pivotal decisions that will affect the course and the outcome of the story.
This first began around 2012, when Age Tech announced that they would be bringing an English version of Kamaitachi no Yoru to smartphones, called Night of the Kamaitachi. However, this release never materialized for whatever reason, and it would take a few more years before Kamaitachi would finally arrive on the Western App Store in 2014, courtesy of Axis Games. A longtime veteran in the localization industry named Jeremy Blaustein created the script for this English release, but while its prose were well written, the translation is somewhat infamous for its alterations to the original story. The Japanese setting was swapped for British Columbia, and the names and even ethnicities of all the characters were rewritten. Toru and Mari were changed into Caucasian vacationers named Max and Grace, and the characters that were once from the Kansai region of Japan were now rowdy Texans. The legend of the Kamaitachi yokai was also replaced with the Banshee from Irish folklore, with the game itself being retitled to The Banshee's Last Cry. Chunsoft even went the extra mile and replaced many of the photographs with images of an inn called Alpine Lodge in Whistler, British Columbia, to better match the game's new setting. All of these rewrites were made to try and make the title more accessible to a mainstream American audience. But despite this extra effort, Banshee's Last Cry didn't seem to make much of an impact in the mobile market. The title's planned Android port never saw the light of day, and the iOS version was never updated to run on modern firmwares, so it is no longer playable through official means. Thanks to this, few have actually experienced this localization of Kamaitachi, and the release is only remembered today for its script changes. However, this would not be Chunsoft's final attempt at translating one of their sound novels. In 2012, Chunsoft would end up merging with the aforementioned Spike and became Spike Chunsoft. After this merger, the company found a surprising amount of success in the West with story-heavy games like Danganronpa and Zero Escape. The sales of these games encouraged the company to begin publishing their own titles outside Japan, instead of solely relying on third-party publishers. This led to Spike Chunsoft releasing the first two Danganronpa games on Steam in 2016, which each sold 200,000 copies. One of Spike Chunsoft's localization directors, David Craker, took note of this data and used it to convince the higher-ups that Western audiences were hungry for more niche Japanese titles, and actually pitched them on the idea of localizing 428. Even a decade after its release, 428 was still considered one of the company's most prestigious titles in their catalog, and it seemed like a great fit for the story-hungry audience Spike Chunsoft was beginning to cultivate in the West. So, the project was given the green light, and an English release of 428 was announced in 2017 under the name 428 Shibuya Scramble. The title was ported to the PlayStation 4 as well as the PC, and the localization was handled by Kevin Frayne and Alexander O. Smith at Kajia Productions, who crafted a script that both read beautifully in English while also being faithful to the original source material. And when 428 launched in September 2018, the game received well-deserved positive buzz from critics. But it never seemed to make a big splash outside of a small handful of people. The game was the West's first real introduction to the sound novel series, and it just didn't seem to appeal to the same fans that enjoyed stuff like Danganronpa, or the visual novels that were popular on storefronts like Steam, especially since those titles were often sold for far less money compared to 428's premium $50 price point. After all these attempts to modernize and localize their sound novels, Spike Chunsoft would finally put the entire franchise in the vault. Shin Kamaitachi no Yoru would sadly mark the end of the sound novel series, being the last installment that wasn't a port, remake, or a translation into another language. In the years to follow, the company would focus instead on their other franchises and develop other kinds of adventure games, with most of Chunsoft's sound novel catalog remaining absent on modern platforms. the series basically just became another IP that was relegated to pachinko machines and the odd stage play. As for the people that helped create the sound novel franchise, many of them would go their separate ways. Kazuya Asano would continue working on a number of different projects as a freelancer, such as the critically acclaimed Jusei to Diamond in 2009, but today he is mainly active in the mobile market. Takemaru Abiko would continue his career as a novelist, but he would also maintain a strong working relationship with Chunsoft, helping them to write a few different titles, such as Trick Logic on the PSP. He would even team up again with Asano one last time in 2013 to develop the starship Damri as part of Level 5's Guild series on the Nintendo 3DS. After working on Machi and the PS1 remake of Otogirisou, Shukei Nagasaka would go on to develop another sound novel with Sammy Corporation in 2002, called Higam Bana. However, the game was such a huge flop both critically and commercially that he decided to leave the game industry completely to once again focus on making screenplays. Jiro Ishii would end up leaving Chunsoft in 2010 to join Level 5, where he tried to create a spiritual follow-up to 428, called Time Travelers, in 2012. The game featured an impressive, fully animated presentation, and was released simultaneously on every major handheld platform at the time, yet it also failed to find an audience. Ishii would then move on to become a freelancer on all kinds of different projects, both in and outside of games. Yukinori Kitajima, Ishii's regular writing partner, would end up founding a scenario writing company in 2009 that has contributed to all sorts of different projects, ranging from Ishii's Time Travelers, to Fire Emblem Fates, to even the Senran Kagura franchise. Other less celebrated staff members that worked on the sound novel series would also go on to create other well-regarded titles. For example, Koichiro Ito, scenario director on 428, would go on to direct an FMV detective game at Square Enix called The Centennial Case in 2022. And Tsuyoshi Furuta, scenario writer on Imabiki So and script director on 428, would go on to join Sega in 2011, where he has since written for the Like a Dragon / Yakuza series. And finally, Koichi Nakamura, the man who came up with the concept for this whole franchise and founded the company who developed it. For many years, Nakamura would continue to help guide Spike Chunsoft as a chairman until he retired from the position in 2020. But a few years prior, while promoting the English release of 428, Nakamura expressed that he was still a fan of the sound novel genre, and even mused about the idea of creating a third title set in Shibuya. Sadly, this would never come to pass, and Nakamura admitted that Spike Chunsoft had no future plans to develop new sound novels, as they simply no longer made enough money to justify the risk. The sound novel originally began as a simple experience Chunsoft could develop on a low budget with a small team, but the franchise eventually ballooned so much in scope that new entries in the series could cost as much to make as a full-blown RPG, or even a feature-length film. Because of this, Koichi Nakamura has said that he struggled to find a place for sound novels in the greater world of entertainment. After all, if a sound novel had production values that were similar to a movie, why wouldn't a player just spend their time watching an actual movie instead? What was the right context, the right premise, the right presentation needed to make sound novels make sense in the modern landscape? Sadly, despite their effort, Chunsoft was never really able to find the answers to these questions. When observed in this light, the sound novel franchise may seem like an antiquated genre that had its time in the mid-90s, but that no longer has a place in the modern industry. Something that is worth forgetting about. Something that had no real lasting legacy. However, that couldn't be further from the truth. Chunsoft's sound novels may have struggled in their later years, but their impact on the hearts and minds of Japanese creators is so huge that it is almost impossible to measure. The mid-90s and early 2000s saw a tidal wave of horror games coming out of Japan, thanks to the huge success of titles like Resident Evil. However, some of the creators that came into prominence during this Japanese horror boom have stated that it was actually Otogirisou that first introduced them to a type of horror that was unique to video games. This includes the likes of Keiichiro Toyama, the creator of Silent Hill 1 and the Siren series, as well as Makoto Shibata, director of the Fatal Frame franchise. Toyama specifically has stated that Otogirisou left a lasting impression on him, describing that the game gave him a sense of bottomless fear, thanks to its seemingly endless looping structure. Additionally, Toyama has even told Jiro Ishii that Siren's multi-perspective storytelling was inspired in part by Machi. So without Otogirisou and Chunsoft's other sound novels, these horror franchises may have turned out very different. As stated previously, Kamaitachi caused a sound novel gold rush on the Super Famicom and PS1, where dozens of developers released their own competing entries in the genre. One of the most notable companies that jumped on this trend was the creators of Final Fantasy, Squaresoft. In the original Japanese release of Final Fantasy Tactics, Square actually included bonus side stories that expanded on the history of the game's world, all of which were presented in the form of sound novels. However, the year prior to Tactics, Square also produced a standalone sound novel with RPG elements called Radical Dreamers that surprisingly served as a pseudo-sequel to the much-beloved Chrono Trigger. The game was penned by Trigger's scenario writer, Masato Kato, and was quickly produced for Nintendo's Satellaview service in 1996, after only 3 months of development. This quick turnaround left Kato unsatisfied with Radical Dreamers' half-finished state, which eventually motivated him to reimagine the game's story and characters as an RPG in 1999, called Chrono Cross. While divisive at the time, this PlayStation sequel to Chrono Trigger is now considered a classic RPG of its era, but it may have never been released at all if it wasn't for the sound novel boom ignited by Chunsoft. Back in the mid-90s, a writer and designer named Hiroyuki Kano was famous within the eroge industry for his adventure games, with titles like Eve Burst Error gaining popularity even outside the typical audience for adult games. According to a former colleague, the late Kano had a lot of admiration for Chunsoft's sound novels and drew inspiration from their titles when creating his early hits. This is most evident in Kano's most famous creation, a time-traveling epic released in 1996 called Yuno. Yuno took the flowchart that operated in the background of titles like Kamaitachi no Yoru and turned it into something that the player could directly interact with. This system basically allowed the player to travel between periods of time they had already experienced by selecting nodes on a map that displayed the diverging paths in the branching narrative. This idea of transforming a normally invisible element of game design into a visual piece of gameplay was very innovative for its time and would go on to influence many other future game creators, and perhaps even inspired Chunsoft themselves to add interactive flowcharts into their later sound novels. Around the same time of Yuno's release, another eroge developer named Leaf saw the success of Chunsoft's games and decided to basically make their own imitation of Kamaitachi no Yoru. The title was a horror game called Shizuku, which looked and played almost exactly like Chunsoft's titles. The only difference was the game's character portraits, with the cast being rendered in a cute bishoujo style instead of vague silhouettes. This title quickly spawned a trilogy of games that branded themselves as the Leaf visual novel series, directly aping Chunsoft's own brand name, while modifying the title slightly to emphasize Leaf's larger focus on graphical detail. The series slowly gained a cult following within Japan's doujin scene, until the release of its third entry in 1997, called Two Heart. which combined the dating elements seen in titles like Tokimeki Memorial with the gameplay of a typical sound novel. This caused its own chain reaction of influence within the novel game genre, and would eventually establish what the West often classifies as visual novels today, a term that Leaf themselves coined with this trilogy. Speaking of the doujin scene, the incredible popularity of sound novels led to the creators of the RPG Maker series, ASCII, publishing a sound novel creation tool in 1996. This allowed players to easily create their own sound novels on the Super Famicom and later CD-based systems. One of the people who purchased this software was a young man that now goes by the pen name of Ryukishi07. Growing up, Ryukishi was a huge fan of Chunsoft's sound novels and the many titles they inspired, so he decided to use ASCII's software to make his own novel game. Sadly, his creation was accidentally deleted before it was finished, but the story Ryukishi had crafted for this game stuck in his head. Later, he would write a stage play that was extremely similar to the novel game he had lost, and when the stage play failed to get produced, he eventually fleshed out the story into a PC doujin game in 2002, called Higurashi When They Cry. Higurashi would turn out to be immensely popular, jump-starting Ryukishi's career as a writer, where he would produce many more famous novel games in the future. And since he was so inspired by Chunsoft, Ryukishi would classify many of his titles specifically as sound novels, and he would even go on to write a new scenario for the 2017 remake of Kamaitachi no Yoru. At the peak of Kamaitachi no Yoru's popularity, various fan clubs were formed throughout Japan. One of these clubs, based in Yokohama, would end up creating their own original game inspired by Kamaitachi called 1999 Christmas Eve. This freeware game was surprisingly popular in the early 2000s and was created using a free scripting engine called Kirikiri. This engine was still very new at the time, so the game's developer often communicated with Kirikiri's creator to get help coding the title, a programmer named WD. These communications played a big part in WD creating the CAG framework, an extension to Kirikiri designed to make it easier to develop novel-style games similar to 1999 Christmas Eve. Thanks to this, many other developers would end up using Kirikiri to create all kinds of visual novels throughout the aughts and into the present day, ranging from doujin works to professional products. But the most famous title to be developed using the Kirikiri engine has to be Type Moon's world-famous Fate Stay Night. In fact, since Fate's release in 2004, Type Moon has continued to use the engine to create all of their modern visual novels, including the recently released remake of Tsukihime. But Chunsoft's influence on Type Moon doesn't end with this indirect connection. Type Moon's founders were in fact big fans of the company's sound novels, with many of their visual novels even containing references to titles like Otogirisou and Kamaitachi no Yoru. Their admiration for Chunsoft's work was unsurprisingly also the main reason Nasu and Takeuchi later agreed to collaborate on 428 Shibuya Scramble. Nasu has even stated that, "We are here because Chunsoft created the sound novel. This is an irrefutable fact. Chunsoft's sound novel is like a father to me. For example, my feeling when asked to work on 428 was similar to Shinji's in Neon Genesis Evangelion, when Gendo told him,
乗るなら早くしろ。出なければ帰れ。
Kotaro Uchikoshi, the creator of Zero Escape and the Somnium Files, is another modern developer that was very directly influenced by Chunsoft's sound novels. Outside of being a Chunsoft employee for many years, the man plainly stated in a 2013 GDC talk that Kamaitachi no Yoru, in his mind, created the modern-day visual novel genre as we know it, and that his own games were greatly influenced by the title. Jiro Ishii, who served as a producer on the first Zero Escape, even stated that he thought of the game as a sound novel in all but name, and that he hoped that the title would eventually become the Kamaitachi no Yoru for the DS generation. Uchikoshi has also referenced Kamaitachi several times in the Somnium Files, with blue silhouetted characters featured throughout the series, and the original game even containing an Easter egg that directly mentions the murders that took place at Spur. To top it all off, Uchikoshi even helped create a little-known Kamaitachi no Yoru spin-off in 2006 that was played through the use of a cell phone email client, where the player had to send messages to someone trapped at Spur. Nowadays, Uchikoshi works alongside his friend Kazutaka Kodaka at their company Tukio Games. You may know Kodaka as the creator of the hugely successful Danganronpa series, which contains its own fair share of references to Chunsoft sound novels. There is even a spin-off to Danganronpa called Otogirisou that is a direct parody of Otogirisou. Even after listing all these examples, it still doesn't even cover the tip of the iceberg of the many creators that have been directly or indirectly influenced by Chunsoft sound novels. For example, while never explicitly stated, titles like 13 Sentinels by Vanillaware are clearly iterating on the multi-protagonist structure established by sound novels like Machi. Even the game's character select screen looks very reminiscent of 428. Another recent game with a similar structure is the critically acclaimed Paranormicite by Square Enix. This multi-perspective horror adventure was directed and written by a man named Takanari Ishiyama, who actually got his start creating mobile games in the early 2000s, many of which were basically sound novels that took clear inspiration from games like Kamaitachi in some instances. And speaking of Square Enix, the original Nier contains a sequence that is presented in the form of a sound novel, and is even classified as such by many fans and publications in Japan. Even recent RPGs directed by the creator of Final Fantasy have also contained similar sound novel segments. And the list just goes on and on and on. So that's the story of Chunsoft's sound novel series, a once prolific franchise that has had many ups and downs throughout its 30-year history, but whose influence on the industry is undeniable. Looking at its legacy through the lens of a Western fan is very interesting, because many of the works it helped inspire are very popular with an international audience. Plus, the visual novel genre as a whole, which has gained a strong following in the West, owes its very existence to Chunsoft sound novels. Yet, despite all this, the originator of all these concepts remains inaccessible and relatively unknown to many English-speaking fans. We basically lack the context for an entire genre of video games. Thankfully, this has begun to change in recent years. While the English iOS release of Kamaitachi no Yoru is no longer playable, there was a fan translation released for the 2017 remake. Nowadays, there are also not just one, but two English translation patches available for the original Super Famicom version of Otogirisou, the starting point for this whole series. And of course, there is still the fantastic release of 428 Shibuya Scramble, which is still available on the PS4 and PC. Even in Japan, Spike Chunsoft has just recently re-released Kamaitachi no Yoru Triple, finally making the original Kamaitachi trilogy available on modern hardware. Hopefully this means we could eventually see more of Chunsoft's sound novels receive official English localizations in the future. Maybe someday Spike Chunsoft will even continue the sound novel franchise with a brand new installment. At the very least, if Chunsoft won't continue the franchise, then Jiro Ishii will do it himself, with the man recently funding a new Shibuya-based adventure through a successful crowdfunding campaign. Perhaps this project could inherit Chunsoft's legacy and reinvigorate the sound novel genre once it launches in 2028. Who knows? But regardless, even if it remains largely dormant, Chunsoft's sound novels deserve to be recognized for their historical importance. While their sales never matched the incredible success of larger franchises and other genres, Chunsoft's audio-enhanced text adventures have a storied legacy that left a huge impression on the video game medium as a whole. It truly lived up to its own promise of breaking new ground and establishing a new genre. Not bad for something that wasn't initially even considered to be a real video game.